there was this moment in understanding this issue when I learned about how the limits were set that changed everything for me. So here we have a little mouse. The way our limits were set were based on small mice, rats, small monkeys that were exposed to wireless radiation, microwaves, for a very short amount of time, under an hour. They had been previously trained to press a lever for food. They were exposed in under an hour, and the level at which they stopped pressing the lever for food, that is the level at which the engineers who were doing the research decided that's bad. Like, something's going on. This is a behavioral impact. We know it's harming them. They had the temperature measured of the animals, and that overheating level is considered the level of adverse effect that our limits are based on.
I first want to go into the basis for the exposures that limits that have been established by the ICNIRP and the FCC. These go back to studies that were conducted in monkeys by the Navy, U.S. Navy Department in the 1980s. And what the studies were based on were rats and monkeys that were trained to push a lever to obtain food. And after they were trained, they were exposed to radio frequency radiation at different frequencies and power levels. And what was reported was that at approximately a specific absorption rate, this is a measure of the internal absorption of the energy, that at that level of 4 watts per kilogram and higher, the response rates were decreased. This occurred in rats and in monkeys as well. And with monkeys, in addition, there was a 1 degree rise in their body temperature. So a few things about this. One is the number of animals that were studied in these particular groups was very small. There were 8 rats and 5 monkeys. And this is the basis for the exposure limits that are being used throughout the world. The studies were 40-minute or 60-minute durations. These are acute exposures. They don't tell you anything about long-term exposure. And they're only a single endpoint, this behavioral response to pressing a lever. This does not meet any reasonable standard for characterizing the potential of a hazardous agent.
That is how our limits were set. They are not set looking at biological effects that are non-heating related, long-term exposure, or from cumulative sources, or looking at children's vulnerability, or what the impacts might be to wildlife. They were set based on these small animal studies, and arbitrary safety factors were used to drop that level down, and that's how our U.S. limits were set. It is unacceptable and indefensible. Now, our limits were set in 1996. In the year 2000, T-Mobile commissioned a report. The Ecolog Institute did it. It recommended an exposure level based on the science at that time, 1,000 times lower than FCC's current power density limit. 1,000 times lower. So when you hear that a cell tower is just 1% of the limit, well, the Ecolog Institute recommended 1,000 times lower. And now we have so much more science and research to support the knowledge that there are non-heating effects, because our limits are only based on overheating effects. I know some of you are coming here from other countries, so you're dealing with ICNIRP limits, but in the US, we have not had a scientific review of our limits since, actually not in 1996 either, but our limits were set in 1996 and have not been updated since then. So how did this happen? Well, there used to be a very active research program in the United States Through the 70s and 80s, we had a robust EPA laboratories, staff who were measuring, monitoring, studying this issue, issuing reports on radiofrequency radiation. In fact, the EPA was tasked to develop safety limits, but was defunded. The Telecom Act passed in 1996, and at that time, the FCC adopted RF limits. Legal action was filed by several groups, and you'll probably hear about the Cellular Phone Task Force case against the FCC. And in it, the groups allege that these limits are not acceptable. And there's many people still working on the issue now who are in that case. The court did not have a favorable ruling for the petitioners. The key reason was they said that the FCC could reasonably expect agencies such as the EPA to keep abreast of scientific developments. And they talked about how the EPA had been on the verge of releasing its own draft guidelines. So at that time, the court thought and believed erroneously that the EPA was working on this issue, when in fact, at that time, there was very little activities left in the EPA related to researching the health effects of wireless radiation. This is in my paper in Frontiers on Public Health, because I think it's so important to note. So when the EPA was, just as it was poised to release safety standards, a safety standard means that agencies have looked at the issue, they have developed it based on science, but we never did. This is a briefing that they did to the FCC about it, where they talk about their strategy. Phase 1 is going to be interim exposure guidelines, where they're going to look at known effects. Then they're going to also look at modulation, pulsation, the complexity of the wave, and come up with some final exposure guidelines. This was fully defunded. The EPA never developed safety limits for wireless radiation or for non-ionizing radiation. This is the last review that was published on radiofrequency radiation. It's from 1984, The Biological Effects of Radiofrequency Radiation. And I talk about this in my paper and document it. So if you want to go to the sources, or you can do that in the paper in Frontiers that I published in December. So we have a regulatory gap. There's no review of the totality of evidence by any U.S. federal agency in the near recent times. No risk or hazard assessment, no science-based evaluation of FCC limits. Are they appropriate? Normally, you would take the level at which credible research that you've evaluated has shown harm based on a process, and you would compare it to FCC limits and ask, are these limits acceptable? That has not been done. There is, in fact, a near absence of EMF non-ionizing radiation activities by all U.S. regulatory agencies with health, safety, or environment expertise. Now, in our case against the FCC, I guess I should take a step back. So in 2019, the FCC said, after 7 years of an open inquiry when information was submitted to the record, they made the decision that they didn't need to change their limits. And both myself, at the time I was executive director of Environmental Health Trust, and other petitioners then took legal action against the FCC with 10,000 plus pages of evidence. And in 2021, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit ruled in our case that the FCC's decision not to update its 1996 wireless radiation limits was arbitrary and capricious. And the court found that the FCC had not provided evidence of properly reviewing the record evidence related to non-cancer impacts. That would be like impacts to the brain, reproductive system, immune system, long-term exposure, children's vulnerability, environmental effects.